Jean Grey, Dark Phoenix, one of the most complex psychologies and stories that we've seen in a comic book landscape. This thing is like all about emotions on the highest level. And let's talk about how this is. Like, Jean wears a lot of roles within the X-Men. First, in her role, Jean Grey is the emotional core. She's empathic, she's dependable, she's steady, but beneath all that is real flaw. Like, Jean builds her identity based on how other people see her. As Cyclops' partner, as Xavier's prized pupil, as the team's heart. So she's comfortable as long as her worth is reflected back through other people. And that's kind of not strength, that's actually dependency, but it's dressed up in this like kindness, right? This giving of others. So what happens is that the Phoenix Force itself is just cosmic balance. It's as much destruction as it is creation and renewal. What we get from Jean is a lot more heavy on the destructive aspect, but none of the creation renewal aspects. So that's a little weird. So again, this is not evil, it's amplification. Other hosts have carried this Phoenix Force without obliterating galaxies. So that means that the meltdowns with Jean isn't about Phoenix, it's about Jean herself. So the Phoenix didn't twist her into something new, it magnified what was ever there. Her insecurities became obsessions, her regression became indulgence, her need for approval became a cosmic form of tyranny. And she was always fragile because she tied her own self-worth to outside validation. So when given godhood, this fractures internally become fault lines throughout the universe. And here's the crux. For all of her conformity, which she hated, no one forced Jean into repression. No one strapped her in a box. She chose to play the agreeable, self-sacrificing role, and that's because it was safe to do this, to be loved as a good Jean, rather than be your full self and risk even that rejection. So the choice gave her like this temporary comfort, but it meant that she never built an identity rooted in her own self-esteem. So when the Phoenix comes in and strips all that stuff away, she wasn't liberated. She was just exposed as raw as she was. So Dark Phoenix isn't Jean as victim. She's Jean as mirror. Like, here is who you are when the universe itself stops telling you no. Nothing can stop you. What are you gonna do? And what she does is terrible. Like, that's why she's particularly dangerous, because she's not possessed, right? Just because this is allowing her to be who she is without discipline, without humility, without anything to guide it. So this is a really big breakdown of the mind state and really revealing about her, because again, this Phoenix Force is a natural force. Yes, it destroys, but it creates an equal value, but Jean never reflected any of that.